Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session, Using Animations for Complex Stories. Thanks for joining us. My name is Dallas Jessup, and I'm the Global Content Marketing Manager here at BrightTALK. So I'd like to welcome today's guest, my colleague, Simon Grzina, the VP of Global Content Business for BrightTALK Studios. Now, for those of you who might be unfamiliar with BrightTALK Studios, they're really the creative powerhouse behind BrightTALK that produces stellar video content for B2B companies around the globe. Now, I'll pass the mic to Simon in just a second, but please bear with me while we cover a few quick notes about the presentation and the BrightTALK platform. So today's webinar will be available on demand after we wrap up and will be accessible through the URL you're currently on. Now, we'll send a follow-up email with the link as well, but essentially same link, it's not a different access code, so really easy for you guys. So feel free to share that directly or use the social icons at the bottom of your screen. So we've also added some attachments, which are available through the Attachments tab. There you can find some related content, as well as some useful guides and resources. Now, we want this to be a conversation, so if you have a question at any time during the presentation, ask it using the Ask a Questions tab at the bottom of your screen, or you can tweet us at BrightTALK. So we'll be answering questions throughout the session, but if we happen to not get to your question, we'll make sure to follow up afterwards. So without further ado, I'm excited to welcome our presenter. Simon, over to you.
Thanks so much, Dallas. So I'm going to jump right in because we have a lot to talk about today. And I'm going to do exactly the wrong thing, and I'm going to get us started with a little bit of a history lesson. We've all seen this quote. We've all heard this. The interesting thing is it turns out it's a little bit of a misquote, actually. But I think it does get to the spirit of the original. Now, Arthur Brisbane was a newspaper reporter and an editor who ended up working very closely with William Randolph Hearst, the famous newspaperman publisher. And Brisbane was known for his forceful, aggressive journalistic style. This was really the heyday of newspapers, and he understood the importance of capturing an audience's interest and attention in a really crowded marketplace. The reason I prefer this phrasing, the original phrasing, is that he's actually really offering us an opportunity, a way to get our messages out more quickly and efficiently by being visual. But really, I prefer this quote of his even more. Now again, he may have been writing about newspapers, but I think the message is just as relevant for us who live in the world of content marketing. Really it's a triumph to get our audience's attention in the first place, and it's something we fight really hard to do, so it's incredibly important to make the most of that attention whenever we do get it. If we fast forward quite a number of years, we get to Dr. James McQuivey from Forrester. And he had a groundbreaking content marketing study titled How Video Will Take Over the World, where he introduced the idea that if a picture was worth 1,000 words, then 1 minute of video or animation was actually worth 1.8 million words. Now, he's getting to that number with a little bit of inflationary arithmetic, really by multiplying Brisbane's number by the number of frames per second in video. But I like to think that he actually had something different in mind. He understood that information has a different amount of power depending on how it's conveyed. I think that's an important message. I think, especially in the last few years, a lot of us have heard a statistic that comes from Microsoft about shrinking attention spans. The pull quote is the idea that audiences today have a shorter attention span than a goldfish. But that quote's not just about media overload. It's actually the fact that audiences are getting better at identifying what they do or don't want to engage with, and they need less and less time to process that decision. So I think the goal becomes, in that understanding, to feed an audience high-quality content, not just in the long form with any complexity in that content intact, but as Brisbane said, hitting the audience between the eyes with that content as well. If you can assume no more than 8 seconds of attention, you use those 8 seconds to your advantage. And you really have to hook them with the sizzle of the story, and then ultimately drive them towards a much more complex story. In the 1940s, there was a seminal publication that was revised later on in the 50s and 60s, and then referenced really ongoing from then, by someone named Edgar Dale, and he coined what he called the pyramid of learning. And he found, and it's something that's been tested and reproved any number of times since then, that interactive learning is the most effective activity for information retention. But a combination of visual and verbal learning is the next best thing. And what comes in dead last when it comes to retention, both immediately after about 3 hours and ultimately after 3 days, text alone. Ongoing, as the studies progressed and were retested over the years, people found that subjects retained only 25% of the information contained in text alone after 3 hours, and as little as 10% of the information after 3 days. When I think about this, what I really come away with is the idea that if text is your primary publishing format, are you really comfortable with your audiences forgetting 90% of the information that you've managed to get in front of them? I think it's a good question. When we're really pragmatic about this, I think we get to a sort of scratch my back and I'll scratch yours relationship with your prospects. Ultimately, your audiences want valuable information, and they want it in formats they can consume easily. And you, in turn, want your audiences engaging with your content rather than anyone else's. I think the real upside of both Edgar Dale's and the Microsoft findings are that audiences both prefer to consume video content over other formats, but they also retain the information from animated video at higher rates, which means ultimately that video content can perform more highly in your campaigns. Now, there's no shortage of statistics that bear this out throughout the marketplace. Audiences are really performing loud and clear about what their appetite for different content formats is. And I think that we as marketers see more success when we do feed those appetites. I think it's also no accident that as you look at a lot of these statistics, you see the word conversion popping up a lot. These are short animated videos and short form videos in general. They're usually intended to draw viewers forward to another activity or another piece of content and not necessarily stand on their own. It's not necessarily about trying to cram the entire story that you may need to tell an audience into a minute or 2 minutes or even 30 seconds. It's about telling enough of the story to capture their interest and engagement, and then knowing that there is more depth and more depth available in other places. I think that's a really important concept and something we're going to come back to in just a moment. We're going to change gears for a second. We're going to talk about something that I think of as an engagement ladder. It's basically the idea that there are things that you want an audience member to do, and some of those things are going to be easier, and some of them are going to be harder for the audience to do. We can assume that we're going to have an easier time getting an audience member to take the easier actions, and as a marketer, a more difficult time getting them to take the more difficult actions. Fairly straightforward concept. I think this all is pretty natural to us. Now, what does this mean in practice? I want to talk about a specific example. Arbor Networks regularly publishes their Worldwide Infrastructure Security Report. It's probably not light reading for your next flight, but if you're an information security professional, it's actually a really invaluable collection of insight from one of the world's foremost leaders in network infrastructure and security. It's also a report that Arbor invests a ton of time, resource, and frankly, money into the creation of. So the performance of that as marketing content is really incredibly important to them. This isn't a unique story. Most marketers invest a large portion of their budgets and their effort and time into authoring text content. So I think it's a problem that most marketers can say that they share. Now, the problem here is when I said it wasn't light reading for your next flight, I really wasn't kidding. It's 130 pages long and nearly 30,000 words. And when you think about any PDF icon sitting on basically a vendor website, it's a really big ask to a customer or a prospect to click the download button at all. But imagine how much more difficult it is with those kinds of numbers, 130 pages, 30,000 words, sitting next to that icon. And I think that's even before we consider the information retention challenges that Dale indicates when we have something that's that long and massive. So if we come back to the idea of the engagement ladder again, we can start to map out some of the actions that marketers are frequently trying to encourage their audiences to take and see where they sit on the ladder, understanding in some of these cases we've got easier tasks, and in some of these cases we've got much harder asks of that audience. In Arbor's case, a report like that sits fairly high up on the ladder. It's not only a really long piece of content, but it also sits behind a complete registration form that a viewer has to fill out before they can consume any part of it. So really, they have to cross to that point on the ladder before they really understand if that step that they're taking even has value for them. So what we really have is a ladder that's got broken rungs almost all the way to the top, which means customers and prospects are being asked to make a giant leap to receive any value or even the promise of value. So it's a really big ask. And in this case, Arbor came to BrightTALK Studios with the ask of how can we get audiences up that ladder more effectively. In a case like Arbor, we created a short video adapted from that report. It was designed to carry just the top level information and messages. It's basically the executive summary of a larger document, but it gives the audiences the core story of the report, and it really helps them qualify whether the information in the longer document will be valuable to them. But as it's a short video, there's really minimal barriers to entry. There's a lack of registration form, and it offers all the other marketing benefits we see from video. It's all the statistics that we're all reading every day. Increased conversion in email and social, increased discoverability, increased SEO value, and hosted on your own domain. I think that we can dig up these stats every minute of every day because there's just more and more of them available than ever before. We just know video resonates with audiences. Now, a couple key things about the video. While the report was really data heavy, the video itself was able to focus on just key themes and findings. It's not necessary to repeat all of that data. The audiences who want the data will be converting forward to the text anyway. The video itself should tell a story, and it does so by using the strength of video, being a visual medium. And again, as Dale taught us, when we combine text, voice, and images, we're seeing maximum retention value for everything short of hands-on interactive learning. So again, if we come back to the ladder, having this video means that Arbor's audience no longer has a broken first rung on the ladder. They've got an engagement opportunity now that really asks for very little in return. And as marketers, Arbor is now receiving additional engagement data for any of the audience members that do make it all the way up the ladder, because those audience members are now interacting with multiple pieces of related content. It's giving them much more context about that audience, what mode they're in, what their interests and priorities are. Now, in truth, Arbor didn't stop there. They're also running a series of topically aligned webinars throughout this campaign lifecycle, which really fills in the middle rungs of the ladder. So again, not only does it allow audiences to climb up with fewer leaps, but it also creates a built-in nurture cycle, because you're now publishing content several times over time, and you're re-engaging audiences that may have stopped climbing by continuing to feed them opportunities to receive part of the story or the story in a different medium or through another lens. You're increasing your chance to engage the audience in the way that they want to be engaged, which is a really, really important thing. Now, I want to move on to a few really simple, straightforward best practices that I think help you think about making animation, making the best animated video that you can anytime you are making it. First, if you're marketing across countries, really consider avoiding text-heavy video content. Lean into images, lean into that conceptual way of telling a story. It's much easier and a whole lot cheaper to translate and re-record a voiceover for a video rather than also needing to translate and recreate text elements that live inside that video. And a lot of countries have proven that the audiences in that country only want to consume content in their local language. So if you create animation planning for that translation, you'll get a lot more use and distribution out of it, even if you don't really execute that translation until later on. With the Arbor example that we showed earlier, you'll really see that there's not a ton of text in it, and what text there is sits within easily edited containers. They're really separate elements in the video, and it makes that video easier to revise for future international and cross-audience uses. Now, one thing I will say is that a lot of languages, spoken languages, use a very different number of words to say the exact same thing. So you probably will find that you may have to retime videos and retime animation based on how long that voiceover The same sentence said in German or Mandarin can easily take twice as long as said in English or French, and it's something to factor in. Now I'm going to contradict myself and say that on the other hand, if you're planning a social media distribution campaign for this content, you really have to recognize the nature of that medium. Most native uploads to a platform like Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn, they play in a muted state by default. So it's a really good idea to create video that works equally well with the sound off, like this example that we created for Demandbase, who are in the marketing automation space and account-based marketing. It's really also worth thinking about length of video. In order to stay under 30 seconds, which is the time limit for video for organic posts on some platforms, or closer to 1 minute range, where you expand the length possible for paid campaigns, but you still have an effectiveness length for a platform like that, you might think about segmenting your story into multiple videos. Each main data point or theme can really become its own video, but by having more content and more segmented content, you can also run a more targeted campaign by really looking at the data points that might resonate with different audiences or audiences in different modes. Now, back to Edgar Dale. One of the lessons that we learned from him is that even strong visuals may not be enough. Really make sure that any animated video you create includes a strong voiceover and text components where possible to ensure your audience retains the information and acts on it. Edgar Dale talked about bimodal learners, basically people who may absorb information better visually or absorb better in text. And the truth is, audiences can be either or both. You really don't know which mode is going to be more effective for them. So by feeding the information across those modes, you really do increase your chances of not just connecting with that audience, but having them retain the information that they consume from you. That's especially important with the most crucial information in your video, like the closing call to action. There's a statistic here that I think really demonstrates what happens when you add motion to a previously static call to action alone. And the truth is, the statistics even get better when you talk about adding a verbal component to that as well. But I think there's an added dimension here when you're helping an audience navigate a really complex subject or information, like in the case referenced here, financial information, investing information, market performance information. With really complex subject matter, top of funnel content has the opportunity to educate your prospects first and foremost, and then market to them second. The reason for that is your audience is using your content to try and navigate that complexity itself, to really self-educate and become more comfortable with these concepts. And if you're educating an audience through your content, you're really getting closer to that trusted advisor role, which is something that every salesperson aspires to. It's a stickier relationship with a brand, and it creates advocates from your prospects. It really moves past marketing, and it just jumpstarts a more potent and lasting relationship, and it's something that you should aspire to in every piece of content possible. Now, most of us have seen statistics about completion rates in content across formats, and platforms like BrightTALK and others allow you to see where your audiences are dropping off on videos and especially on webinars. But really think about what completion rates mean through the lens of your content itself. If you're like most marketers and you're putting the call to action in any piece of content at the end of that piece of content, then that means that if 50% of your audience is missing the last 10% of your content, they're also missing the most important part to you, the call to action. I always coach people to think of this like a college term paper. You put your key messages at the top of the content, you reiterate them at the end of the content, and then the middle is for your deep dive. You really want to make sure that no matter how early into a piece of content an audience member drops out, that they're consuming the most important messages to you and to them. Lastly here, a lot of the complexity in marketing stories can come from the fact that they may be data-driven stories. And really, that's not inherently a bad thing. But for a lot of people, data remains abstract until it's tied to meaning. And creating meaning in data can often mean visualization. I think that's the real power of infographics. One of the reasons why audiences have really skyrocketed their consumption of them is an infographic creates a frame of reference for data. It brings meaning to it. So in order to make sure that you're engaging the visual learners in your audiences, you really need to make sure that you're visualizing data and giving it meaning. Here's an example of a video that our team created for Allianz Global Investors, again in the financial services space. And we made a really key point of visualizing every important data element in the story so that the underlying meanings could resonate with the audience, making abstract data into concrete things, concepts that were personally relatable and relevant. And I think that's an important thing to think about in your data-driven content as well. From there, I think I'd love to just take some questions from the audience. I see quite a number of them filtering in, Dallas.
Yeah, we certainly do. So I've been looking through trying to figure out where we're going to start. So I think one of the biggest things that, we've talked a lot about, you've mentioned about the different types of things you can do with animations. I think, there's several of our audience members kind of wanted to know what tools can they use? A couple people mentioned, can PowerPoint do the animations that you're talking about? What products do you recommend? One of our audience members uses VideoScribe, which is kind of like an animated slideshow. So, what products do you guys use? What's kind of being used in the industry, and where do you, kind of balance cost versus quality?
Yeah, those are all really good questions. And I do think that question of balancing cost versus quality is always a question. There is always going to be that how long is a piece of string element when we talk about cost and quality, and a solution for one brand may not be a solution for another. I will say that we were using the term animation really interchangeably, and the truth is animation isn't one size fits all. There's a lot of different kinds of animation, and even in just what we've looked at in the last 20 minutes, we've seen things that are what I might think of as a motion infographic, all the way up to really bespoke character animation. And then when we talk about things like taking a static call to action and moving it, bringing it into motion animation, we may be talking about just literally moving some words on the screen, which is a pretty simple act. I think the truth is that when people talk about creating animation, something like PowerPoint or Keynote, we're not really talking about animation. We're talking about transitions. We're talking about moving from one piece of information to another. And I think of that as being very low value animation. It's pretty, it's window dressing, but it's not actually creating information or clarity from information. So I think it's important to move past the idea of slideshows and past the idea of just making something dance across the screen, and move into the idea, it's that classic presentation mantra of show, don't tell. And if you have a way to create a visual illustration of a concept that you're discussing or a concept that you're trying to educate an audience on, then that's an opportunity for animation. That animation can be as simple as pulling slideshows from stock footage or royalty-free archives. It can be as complex as commissioning a creative agency or a production company to really make something more conceptual, and there's a lot of points in between. Now, I will say that like any piece of brand content, I do think it's important that you think about the amount of value you want to receive and the reflection on your brand. If you're using this to market your brand, I do think it's important that you stay within your brand voice. We have seen a really large explosion of very low-cost animation resources. A lot of the kind of $100 a minute animation or whiteboard animation that we all see on the web. And I think the truth is you're getting something where your story is no more personalized or differentiated than anyone else. And I do think it's important to think about your content being your content, regardless of where it lives and regardless of what you spend on it. And the last thing you want is someone to be consuming your content having absolutely no idea the provenance of it. So I think it's something that I would factor in when you think about budget.
I think that's a good point. So continuing on with kind of budget and kind of the overall process of bringing this into your marketing mix. So we have a couple questions. and I'll try to kind of combine them a little bit, is definitely kind of, essentially everyone's saying that they really love this concept. How do I convince my boss that it's worth the spend, and really how much does this cost me? And if I wanted to do a 1-minute animation, what's kind of the cost that I should be actually looking for?
Yeah, and I would qualify that with how it's intended to be used. We see content that's created that's really only intended for social, and it may have a very short lifespan. You may run a 1 month kind of PPC campaign in Twitter or as a YouTube pre-roll ad, and you may compare that with something that could be the headline storytelling on a company's website, and it's really meant to be the first touch with any audience that you get to reach your domain. I would personally budget those two things very differently. And I think when it comes to something like, that social piece of content or something that's designed to live on your company's blog, I think that there are a lot of options that can be done at very low cost. It's not even classically animation, but I'm a very big fan of whiteboard videos, especially for that kind of a very conceptual topic. And if you can have a product manager or a technical leader in your business stand up and diagram something to you as a marketer on the whiteboard that makes perfect sense, then they could probably do the exact same thing in the exact same format for your audience. And that may be something that's a very cost-effective thing to create. You may be talking about a couple $100s for a video like that. And I think those videos can have a real lifespan. On the other end of the spectrum, if you really are thinking of that sort of edge-to-edge, full bleed, above the fold sort of company value story or product value story that's going to be a headline for the next 12 or 18 months on a company website, I would allocate a budget that I think is commensurate with that. And you're definitely going to be looking at something that could be in the single to tens of thousands of dollars for that. And I don't think you should be afraid of that, because I do think that when I look at video budgets, it's really about how much audience do I expect to acquire with this content and how long do I expect it to be useful to me. And those are really the two factors that I use to set a sliding scale for budgets. One thing I will say is there's a lot that can be done with in-house resources. There's a lot that can be done, again, it's not classically animation, but there's a lot that can be done with tools like a Camtasia or a ScreenFlow, and just simply capturing things moving on screen with very simple editing. And I think that if you are creating very short tactical content, these are good tools to have at your disposal. But I think it's important for everyone to know their limits and set what they're comfortable having the direct responsibility for and what they need a resource that they're comfortable managing for.
Great. I think that kind of goes into our next question, which is kind of, what is the BrightTALK Studios process for helping define and draw out the key messages for their videos? And I think, I definitely want you to be able to speak to that as well, but also just kind of, I think that goes back into, what should people be looking for in picking a creative agency, and how do you really identify people who are really, the real creatives out there that will help you kind of create that superb marketing?
Yeah, those are two very good questions. And I'd almost start with the latter half, the idea of understanding who to work with. And there's something we see not just in animation, but I would say in any kind of video content or really any kind of creative exercise for a brand in the B2B space. And I think we see a lot of companies working with resources that feel very creative. There is an excitement that comes with working with someone who's creative, and it gets you fired up. I think what you have to do is make sure that they're also someone who understands your market space, your product, your value prop, and your audience. Because ultimately, any content you make, whether it is a piece of brochureware or a slide deck template or an animated video, it isn't going to rest on how creative it is. It's going to rest on the relevancy of that messaging to your audience. And that's really where your value is going to come from. The rest of it's really packaging. So I think it's important that you work with resources that understand your message and understand the audience you're trying to engage. And I think that latter part really factors into how we draw messaging out with the customers we work with. And I think it really comes down to being audience-centric. The first questions we always ask a customer with any campaign is, who are you trying to reach with this? What problem are you trying to help that person solve, or what problem are they trying to solve themselves? And how do you help them solve that problem? Because ultimately, the audiences that you're trying to reach are online searching for solutions to problems that they experience. They're searching for answers to questions that they have. And your content needs to be positioned as the answer to a question and then ultimately the solution to a problem. And I think if you work from that audience question back to your message, it'll always matchmake back to whatever solution you have in the marketplace, whatever product you're bringing to market. But you have to start with that connection to the audience relevancy. Otherwise, you're basically shouting at people who don't want to necessarily listen to what you have to say. And I don't think any marketer likes being in that position.
Couldn't agree more. So moving on to kind of, I guess this is more of a sales-oriented question, is, do you have any recommendations for how to use animations for presentations by sales reps and how we might be able to leverage that to close better deals?
Yeah, I think that if I think about the salespeople that I work with and have worked with over my career, there's always parts of that sales interaction, whether it's a presentation or a conversation, that are very situational. Salespeople are just remarkably agile individuals, and there's a lot that they're doing that's based on their ability to read a room and take the temperature of the person sitting across from them, and then change what they're doing to make a better connection with that person. And I think that nothing that a marketer does should take away that salesperson's ability to be agile. But on the other hand, there's a lot of what gets demonstrated or discussed in the average sales presentation that is very much a template. And there's a lot that happens, especially in a sales demo, that is trying to show something live and in real time that they may show 5 times a day, 10 times a day. And I think that when you look at those elements that are frequently reused, you have an opportunity to really optimize them. And again, whether this is capturing a demo, whether this is realizing that with a complex product, especially, we see this in areas like, big data and business intelligence and analytics-based products. They're really showing something that they're demoing a feature rather than showing a value. And I think that that's a prime place to use animation to demonstrate value. And then maybe you touch on the features. But I really don't think that most customers come asking how first and what and why second. And I think it's really the other way around. So animation is really valuable in demonstrating value and then allowing a salesperson to take a more agile approach to demonstrating the how and process. So I think that we frequently get asked with software products to create what I think of as being optimized demos, taking the air out, time compressing things, or being able to really highlight what's relevant in a demo, but bringing it down to a really perfect group of 90-second chunks that a salesperson can chain together to make the demo experience that's really customized to a prospect. But it gives them a library of those tools rather than taking away their ability to create the demo experience that they want to give.
Great. So Scott, and I believe this is going back to your slide around the different statistics around conversions of using animations. And Scott, says, I agree with all these great stats, but I'm curious why after several years of explainer videos, the trend still seems to be fewer videos present on video on the website. So I don't have any stats really to back this up, but it just seems to be the case. What are kind of your thoughts around this?
It's interesting, and as a company that recently redesigned our own websites, I think we asked ourselves the same question. There definitely is this trend to continue presenting most corporate websites and business websites with that kind of big, beautiful image, and then, frankly, often embed video in kind of smaller players, or even worse, a thumbnail on a page hoping someone clicks through. I think some of this is purely a technology question, not to get into the too gory details, but I do think that HTML5 and the implementations of HTML5 to create more mobile compatible video, while they've been coming for a couple of years now, they've been slow to mature, and I think that means that you get a lot of digital marketers and web property managers who are really concerned with what might cause them to orphan any audience or give an unequal experience across browsers or devices. And I do think there's a sense still that that big, beautiful video that may headline your site and be the first impression may only show to some of your audience, and that anyone it's not showing to is getting a second-class experience. I think it's a fair concern. I take a slightly different approach, which is not bring everyone to the same level, but try and create a really good information experience at each level. Understand that those levels may be different. I do see more and more the sizzle video, the brand video on sites, and I think this is something that B2C is doing very well at the moment, and B2B is slowly catching up with. That can always roll over to that static, parallax-infused image, as he mentions, on a mobile device, and I think that's absolutely fair. I think it just raises that question, much like we said about social. If you've got a video that is meant to kind of play behind information and set a tone, but is also going to play muted, just think about how to optimize for that medium. It is something that may not be about information now. It may be about tone. It may be about creating context. And I think that's a good thing. Personally, I wouldn't invest in that video as a primary goal. I would be investing in other videos that I think can message more directly, and I'd be creating that brand element as really an offshoot of another project, because I think that when you're making a brand story or a product story, you're probably capturing that additional video just as part of the process. It's just thinking about how to use it.
Great. Well, I want to be cognizant of everyone's time since I know we promised 30 minutes, but I'd love to jump into two last questions, and then certainly Simon and I will follow up with everyone else offline. So Michael wanted to know I guess this is more towards the use of internal animation videos, but he asked, have you seen it used effectively for targets that are internal to a company? So, for example, IT is trying to present its value in a new system to process objectives for the company. Is that worth it as well?
I think absolutely, yes. I think the only difference is, again, in the budget setting when you're talking an internal audience. But we do work quite a bit with customers who create what I think of as internal comms content, and animation's a part of that. It can also be training content. I think a firm like, for instance, Bank of New York Mellon, who's someone we work very closely with, is a firm that does a really good job of creating internal content, and some of it is for training purposes. They also are a technology company in their own way, and they have a very pressing need to educate their own teams about the use of technology in the firm and new technology that's being released by the firm. I think another side benefit is in what we would think of as sales articulation, creating content that helps your teams who are market-facing or customer-facing to tell your story and to tell it with consistency. And I think that's an important thing. Animation can play equally well in those spaces as in any externally facing market.
Perfect. And then last question for today's session is, we talked a little bit about depending on whether you're trying to go globally and a lot of those things, there's a question kind of around the importance of voiceovers and, how do you find the right voice for an animation, and when should you really, how do you make sure it's appeals globally, as well as when should you just not use one?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say, again, for a video that is designed to be social, maybe this motion infographic concept, you might think about just going without the voiceover entirely, especially if you have a sense that you're not really expecting an audience to sit on that video in a social stream like on Twitter. I think if you also are a company that does market internationally or just in very focused regions, and you don't know that you've got the budget to re-record 3, 4, 5 voiceovers, you may think about going without entirely to just understand the limitations of your budget. That said, I think that every brand has to ask their question of themselves, what is our tone? And I think tone is partly things that define visual creative, use of music. I think it can also be something that defines voice. Most of us have auto handlers in our phone systems. At some point, someone had to make a decision about what voice, male or female, with or without an accent, that should be in that system. And I think the same kind of question has to be asked of our animation content. We do find, especially in North America, that there's a goal to get accentless American English in a way, which I say as a New Yorker is pretty effectively a Northern Californian or slightly Midwestern voice. Iowa sounds great to most Americans. I think when we get into Western Europe, English accents, British English accents carry very well. But I think it's a question that a marketer has to answer for themselves and understand that if they're going to cross regions, it may mean needing multiple voices to make it land well in that region.
And that's a really good point. Is sometimes of course, voiceovers have a dollar sign attached to them, but when you're rolling these out on such a scale to help your business, there's definitely worth having a couple of different versions if you're marketing in different regions. And I think sometimes us as marketers can forget that. So I think that's a really great point that you added. So I want to thank everyone who joined us today and who sat through our Q&A. Would highly recommend that you connect with Simon and the BrightTALK Studios team. They are a phenomenal content creation house that can help you with animations, with webcasting, with live events, and other types of online resources and assets to really kind of help create more online rich media experiences for your business, and they're a pleasure to work with, and we definitely work with them a lot as well internally, so would highly recommend connecting with them. Feel free to connect on social and let us please provide some feedback. We'd love to hear kind of what you liked, what you would like to hear more of, so that we can help creating more content that's tailored to kind of the pressing business issues within your business. So thank you for joining us today, Simon. Did I forget anything?
No, you didn't at all, and thanks for moderating and being here with me, and thanks so much everyone who tuned in.
Absolutely. We'll make sure to follow up with anyone whose questions we didn't get to today. So thank you and have a lovely day.